Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Cowboy State, Wyoming. Wyoming is the least populated state in the country despite being the 10th largest state in terms of land area. It's also the first state, actually before it was a state, to give voting rights to women. That occurred in 1869 when the Constitution of the Wyoming Territory addressed the issue of women's suffrage. The first national park and the first national monument are both in Wyoming as well. The national park is Yellowstone, and the national monument is Devil's Tower, which is prominently featured in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Because Wyoming is so sparsely populated, it has one at-large congressional House district which covers the entire state, and two-term Republican incumbent Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, is running for a third term this November against an undetermined Democratic opponent. As you'll learn from watching this video, Wyoming is a very, very Republican-leaning state, and because of who her father is, Liz Cheney has very high name recognition in the state, which can only help her re-election chances this November. In fact, for her previous two election cycles, that was in 2016 and 2018, she defeated her Democratic challenger by over a 30% margin of the vote both times. The only two counties in the state that she did not consistently carry were Albany County in the southeast, which contains the town of Laramie and the University of Wyoming, and Teton County in the northwest, which contains the ski mountain resort town of Jackson, both relatively left-leaning counties in an otherwise deep red sea. I fully expect Cheney to win a third term, but just for fun, let's pull up a graph to see how Wyomingites vote for their representatives. And here we're looking at voter turnout for both parties within the state of Wyoming for the lone congressional House district. And to back up my claim that Wyoming is a very Republican state, we see just massive gaps with that red line leading that blue line. I mean, early on in the decade, we even had nearly a 50% voter margins of victory in favor of Republicans. We see that gap wane slightly going from, for example, 2012 to 2014 to 2016. Of course, 2016 was the year that Liz Cheney won her first term as the state's representative, but she was still able to win by an over 30% margin of the vote because her very Republican, very rural state turns out for Republicans in very heavy numbers relative to Democrats. Okay, let's toss that aside. There's no real surprise here. Liz Cheney is going to win a third term, no doubt in my mind. Let's make that official, put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in the state of Wyoming. Incumbent Republican Senator Mike Enzi is retiring at the conclusion of his term this year, and we are likely to see an undetermined Republican opponent take on an undetermined Democratic opponent this year. Exactly who those two people are going to be will be determined on August 18th when Wyoming has its state primary. Let's take a look at some voter turnout ratios to see how Wyoming voters turn out for senatorial candidates relative to their House candidate. So here we're looking at some values that, again, even favor Republicans even further than their raw turnout numbers for House candidates does. Going back over the last 10 years and the last three senatorial election cycles, we see Republican Senator Mike Enzi in 2014, along with his Republican colleague John Barrasso in 2012 and 2018, receiving voter ratio values that are higher than 100%, meaning that they're receiving slightly more votes than the Republican House candidate running in the state for each of those years. And for the first two senatorial election cycles this decade, the Democratic challenger received fewer votes than the very small amount of votes that the Democratic House candidate receives, meaning that Republican senators in Wyoming over the last decade have generally received even larger margins of victory than Republican House candidates in the state. There was some slight backlash in 2018 when John Barrasso's Democratic challenger received slightly more votes than the Democratic House candidate running that year, but was not nearly enough to overcome the raw numbers that Republicans enjoy in the Cowboy State. Okay, let's toss those numbers aside. Because there's no incumbent in the race this year because of Mike Enzi's retirement, we're only going to be factoring in raw House turnout versus those voter turnout ratios in our calculations to see how this is going to turn out. So for that, we turn to Pollbot. Let's take those two variables. How's this going to turn out for Wyoming? Okay, and in the matchup between a generic Republican and a generic Democrat for Senate in the state of Wyoming, the Republican candidate is going to win pretty handily by roughly about a 22.2 24% margin of the vote. Had Mike Enzi run for another term, his positive approval rating would have played into this, and I would not have been surprised to see him winning by over 30%. I do expect turnout to be pretty good this year across the country as a whole, and Wyoming I don't see as being any kind of exception to that expectation. And honestly, I think this margin of victory is even kind of narrow for a state like Wyoming that is so heavily Republican. But that remains to be seen. We don't even know who the candidates are yet, but a Republican is definitely going to carry this. So let's make that official and put it on our senatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020 starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Wyoming is a state that last voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in 1964 when they broke for LBJ over Barry Goldwater, as did most states that year. But with the last election cycle where a Democratic candidate received Wyoming's 3 electoral college votes was 56 years ago, it seems like Donald Trump has a leg up slightly in the Cowboy State over Joe Biden this year. When we look back to 2016, we actually saw Donald Trump carry the state over Hillary Clinton that year by an astonishing 46% margin of victory. One of the largest margins of victory in the entire country. Is the number that extraordinary reflected in presidential to House turnout ratios for Wyoming? Let's take a look at that right now. And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. So we're looking at just the last 2 presidential election cycles that we saw over the last decade in 2012 and 2016. And those voter ratios really just opened up in Republicans' favor heavily, going from Barack Obama's re-election in 2012 to Donald Trump's victory 4 years later. Not only did Republicans add about 8.5 percentage points to their voter ratio, but Democrats' voter ratio decreased by, over 40 percentage points, going from Obama to Hillary Clinton. And of course, Obama never won the state of Wyoming in either of his presidential election cycles. So even with a 15% voter ratio advantage that he enjoyed in Wyoming, that wasn't nearly enough to carry him the 3 electoral college votes from the state. So when you add about over 35% voter ratio advantage that Trump enjoyed over Clinton that year, it's no wonder that coupled with raw House turnout in Republicans' favor, that he was able to enjoy a victory with a 46% margin of victory. Okay, and let's toss those numbers aside and lastly examine the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case President Trump. Wyoming is a state that has one of the highest net approval ratings for this president as of this video. Specifically, he's enjoying about a plus 31 points approval rating. Roughly 63% of voters in Wyoming approve of Donald Trump versus 32% that disapprove. Obviously, this state is going to be a shoo-in for a Republican victory at the presidential level, but let's just for fun turn to Pollbot to see. Let's calculate some margin of victory. Pollbot. And there's our result, and I think this is way too low, honestly. Sorry, Pollbot, no offense to you, but 25.37% margin of victory that's way too generous to Joe Biden in Wyoming. Remember, he carried the state over Hillary Clinton by 46% margin of victory. I can't stress enough how insane of a margin that is. I highly doubt that margin is going to decrease by over 20 percentage points just going from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden over 4 years' time, especially in a state like Wyoming that hasn't really changed much in decades. I would honestly expect this to be in probably the upper 30s. That might be more accurate than 25%. These predictions for margin of victory do get a little wacky in states that are so lopsided to one party or the other, because I often have variables built into my equations to take care of major outliers like this, but sometimes that works against me for states like Wyoming in the Republicans' case, or Massachusetts in the Democrats' case, for example. So my instinct, it's telling me it's going to be in the upper 30s margin of victory for Trump. So let's make that official and put that on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the results are in for the Cowboy State, and it's a big red wave. Let's talk briefly about the future of Wyoming by bringing up an old line graph and 2 new ones. First, let's examine raw House turnout numbers a little more closely here. I want to draw your attention specifically to the slope values that we can see in both of these equations for both of these lines. These values are telling us the average rate of increase or decrease in voter turnout every 2 years when we examine the last decade as a whole. So for example, in Wyoming, we're seeing every 2 years, Republicans' voter turnout has actually dropped off by 1,800 votes every 2 years going back over the past decade, whereas Democrats have improved their numbers an average of 4,500 voters every 2 years, netting them a gain of roughly 6,300 votes on their Republican challengers. While at first glance that number probably seems pretty small to a lot of you, remember that Wyoming is the least populated state in the country, so their votes actually count way more as individuals to their state as a whole. The average Wyoming voter is actually the most overly represented voter in the Electoral College, a little side trivia for you there. So every vote really does make a difference in this state, but of course Republicans they've been outvoting Democrats for decades in the state. So if these rates continued completely unchanged for the next several decades, it would still take many dozens of years for Democrats to actually catch up to Republicans. A slope value difference of this caliber would mean much more if the state was even slightly competitive, but it is just not. Next, when we look at these other two line graphs, we're seeing estimated slope values that are increasing for Democrats and remaining relatively unchanged for Republicans when we go back over the last 10 years. When you remember that these voter turnout ratios are relative to raw House turnout numbers, a rate of increase for Democrats of this caliber is ultimately going to be pretty insignificant in a state like Wyoming that is just not competitive at the House level at this point. The rate of increase and decrease in presidential to House voter ratios, on the other hand, tells a slightly different story. And it's mainly because of the difference in performance from Barack Obama in 2012 to Hillary Clinton in 2016, when we saw that value just drop off significantly going from one candidate to the next. That alone is the reason why the rate of decrease for Democrats' voter turnout ratio at the presidential level is pretty noticeable and significant, whereas Republicans' rate of increase, slight increase, is barely noticeable. When we look at all three of these graphs together, because the House races are just so not competitive at all in Wyoming, I don't see any races at any of these levels becoming competitive for many years to come, and especially at the presidential level, as we see that enthusiasm drop off pretty significantly for Democrats going back over the last 10 years. Okay, all of those graphs aside, I just told you, but I don't think Wyoming's going to be changing anytime soon. It's a state that is just not growing at the same rate as most other states in this country, certainly not being urbanized at all. It's a heavily rural area with only a couple pockets of liberal voters near the university and up in a ski resort town in the Northwest. And I think that's mostly the appeal for many of the people that live in Wyoming. It's a state that gets largely overlooked. You can live out in the country on your own. You don't get bogged down by politicians every 4 years because it's just not considered competitive at any level. And the appeal of the Republican Party to rural voters, and as a rule, will continue to play out for the foreseeable future. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I am covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.